And hello. Hello,
Hi
AJ.
there.
How are you doing?
Hi. Doing fine. And you?
I'm doing okay. We are both having some minor technical challenges.
Yes,
AJ is on the bleeding edge with Windows 11, is it?
it
And
is. It is.
I am fighting the new Twitter live stream API that I tested like 5 times on Friday, and now it's acting a little flaky on me. So, anyway, for those people who are able to join via Twitter and YouTube and Twitch, welcome. So, AJ, I don't know if you need an introduction, but I think most people know AJ Kauffmann. And how long have you been in the Navision Nav Business Central world?
That is for 19 and a half years.
Wow. So you've been around a while and you've seen
Yeah,
a few
absolutely.
things. And
Absolutely.
you you seem to be focused heavily on APIs and now related to that OAuth. And
hmm
is that your specialization, or you just happen to have done a lot of projects with those tools?
Um, Actually, when I entered the Nav world back in 2002, I was already introduced as the guy who was going to make website integrations with Navision and web shop integration, stuff like that. So yes, I did quite some web development before, but well, actually I became just a full stack Navision developer with, let's say, healthy interest in integrations and API and stuff like that.
Very cool. Well, I on the Dynamics GP side, my focus was largely system integrations, and so using the API of sorts that we had in that world. So I can definitely relate. Just checking to see how our feed is going. It is a little flaky on my end, but
Yeah,
let's
I
see
can
how it
see it.
goes. Okay, so well, thank you for joining me today. And I was going to, I just wanted to share for the other people in the BC world one recent aspect of my journey with BC APIs, and that is OAuth, and near and dear to your heart as well. And let me just switch over to our slides here, if I can figure that out. So, I guess a little background before we jump into OAuth. And as I mentioned to you in a prior call, my I've worked with APIs, and I think, API, that's pretty straightforward. I'm a developer. I've done this many times. There are different APIs and quirks to each one, but
Mm,
in my experience with, say, a public API, I have typically worked with API keys, right?
hmm
So I think many developers are familiar with this. So
Yep.
this is a screenshot for the authorize.net API key setup page. And they give you a login ID, which is just some static string. And then they give you an API key, which is, again, just a string. You have to
Mm,
store that securely, you pass it in, and that's how you authenticate. It's a glorified username and password, really. Maybe
Exactly.
there's
Yeah.
an expiration date on the key, but that's about it. You can change the key just like you can change the password. And this is Stripe here. So very similar. You have
Mm,
a couple types of keys. You have test keys, you have production keys, but it's essentially like a username and password. So when I first started using Business Central, I learned about this web service access key. Same concept, right? You send in your
Right.
username and this static web service access key here at the
Yeah.
bottom. That can have an expiration date, but very similar concept. However, as we now know, all good BC developers know that the web service access key is deprecated. It's not removed yet, but it will be removed as of 2022 Wave 1. And that was
Exactly.
postponed, right?
Yeah, it was postponed. About a year postponed, actually.
Yeah, and so it was a little more complex, I think, for the dev team and for us as developers. So they gave us an extra year, which I'm very thankful for. But now we are finally going to have to move off of this web service access key. And I also just coincidentally received an email that other services are removing basic auth, as it is also called.
Yeah.
And so in this case, Exchange Online is removing basic auth as well. So
Yeah.
across the board, these basic web service type keys are basic auth, at least certainly in the Microsoft realm. They are dropping that to move to OAuth, which I totally understand the reasons for that. And for those of you who are not familiar with Microsoft's OAuth, and feel free, AJ, to jump in to provide more context to this, it is not just OAuth, like some generic, white wrapper OAuth. It is Microsoft's version of OAuth provided by the Azure. It has several names, which doesn't help with the confusion. I've seen one reference to the Microsoft Identity Platform, another to OpenID Connect, and then there's Azure App Registration. So depending on whoever is writing the documentation, you may see several different names attached to this, but
Yes.
effectively it is OAuth 2.0 is really the bottom line.
That's the correct. But the thing is that OAuth is actually, it's the, let's say, the protocol, the concept, and the Microsoft Identity Platform. You could think of that as the framework that Microsoft built around it. Consists of a number of objects that you use against the Azure platform, which is built around the OAuth protocol. The concept is the same as everywhere. That's an overall open standard, and it's governed by a couple of companies, including Microsoft. But that is the concept, which can be implemented in, let's say, some different flavors by different companies.
And the flavor of the implementation for Microsoft is one of the things, in hindsight, it's not complicated, but it's because it was different than what I'm used to with APIs and API authentication. I was actually quite confused. And so some of the initial documentation I found here involves app registration. And so this is and I haven't used other OAuth platforms, but this confused me because this was an additional step where I had to go to Azure, my Azure Active Directory portal, and set up what is called an app registration. And this is, I now know, telling Azure Active Directory and the underlying OAuth, hey, I want to be able to authenticate against this app, whether that's Business Central, Office 365, Microsoft Graph, you name it. I need to have a registration for, in theory, each of these apps.
Well, it's not so strange. If you consider that the application that wants to use OAuth actually needs to have its own identity. It needs to have an account that others can say, I trust this application. So there must be somewhere a registration that represents that application. And that is what Microsoft calls the app registration, which basically creates, let's say, a similar thing as a user account that you create in an Azure Active Directory. But now it's not a user account, it's now an app registration or principal or whatever you want to call it. But it represents that application. So there can be trust bound to it, permissions, secrets, etc. I would think that any OAuth implementation requires a similar thing.
Yeah, and it might be, but I guess sharing my bumbling experience, like trying to figure this out. When I first read the instructions of some, I don't even think it was a Business Central guide, but it was a generic. This is when I first tried it. It was some guide showing how to set up OAuth on Azure. I was like, what is going on? And what is a redirect
Yeah,
URL? And I didn't have any context for it. So for me, it was actually quite confusing.
of
Now that
course.
I've done it a few times, it's like, okay, I'm kind of seeing how these pieces fit together. I'm
Hmm.
still not totally comfortable with the different flows that we'll talk about later, but I get the concept. Okay, if I want to do OAuth through an Azure service, here's where I need to go. I need to create an app registration, set a scope, things like that. And it kind of starting to make sense. But for anyone who's not familiar with that process, I would say I was very confused. So don't be surprised if you're a little confused understanding all these pieces. And the other
Yeah.
challenge I had was I did it once and then had to work on other stuff. And when I came back to it a couple months later, I'd completely forgotten. I was like, where is it in Azure? I didn't remember it was in Azure Active Directory, and I didn't remember the object name. So it was new to me. And so the terminology was a hurdle for me. So
Mm.
yeah, so
I
for
can
you,
imagine.
it's probably very obvious, and we'll get to some of the background teaching that you offer in your OAuth course. But yeah, so okay, so that was the app registration, and this like they provide this picture like, oh yeah, and I'm like I could have looked at this 10 times and it wouldn't have made sense to me. But
Hmm.
now it's like, oh, okay, I kind of get that there are a few moving pieces here. And
Yes,
I am now know you kind of should understand all of these components and how they work. You
the four
can try to
components.
rush forward and just set something up and say, oh, I got it working. But without understanding how these pieces are working together, you
Hmm.
may run in, make your life difficult later if you need to implement in a slightly different way or if you make a change.
Yeah, that's correct. But in fact, you look at this picture, and you can draw this picture in many ways. But as you probably recall, that I used the same thing in the OAuth course, just draw the picture a little bit different. But what we are used to in Business Central, if we have the Business Central online platform, three of those four parts are already there. We have a resource owner. We have that's the end user. We have Business Central, which is the resource server. We have Azure Active Directory, where your user account is sitting. So three of these four parts are already there.
Okay.
You get that?
I do. But for me, it's like I thought of it as a direct connection to Business Central Web API with my username and a web service access
Of
key.
course.
Like
Of course,
that's
but how do
just
you get that how do you get that username to start with? And
right, right.
I mean,
So Business Central was serving the role of the identity platform effectively, right?
exactly.
And so now they're turning that off within Business Central and pushing that responsibility to Azure. Makes
Hmm.
total sense. And I
Yes.
understand the benefits. It does add a little bit of complexity, technically, additional layer, but makes total sense. So I've mentioned your course a few times. So for those who don't know, AJ has taught some online courses starting in 2020, I think, with your
Yes.
the BC Web API course that I took, and you can go to his website Kauffmann.nl, and under trainings, there's information about the OAuth course and the BC Web API course. And those are not, I don't think you have a future date for those classes at the moment.
That's correct. That's
Okay, but
correct.
if people are interested in taking those classes, if he gets enough interest, he can reschedule a new version of those. And it's a fair amount of work for
Absolutely.
AJ, multiple days. There, I think there are a couple hours a day.
Yeah, that's correct. And actually, it was just, well, it started, of course, in COVID time. I was used to delivering classes on site, in-house, throughout actually the whole world. So, but then, yeah, we were stuck at home. We don't need to talk about that, but that
Yeah.
was a very good alternative. And now that we're a little bit back on track with visiting customers, it's going to be a little bit more hard to have a good planning for these online courses.
Got
But
it.
still, if there is demand and if people ping me and say, hey, I need it, or they want me to have on site, then yeah, please just let me know.
And now you have mentioned that your courses are compiling information that is publicly available. And while that is true, having attended both of your courses, I can absolutely say that the collection of that information in a course with explanation absolutely is vastly superior to me attempting to learn that information through 35 different websites and web pages. And a few examples are that during your web service or web API course, you explained how the OData query string and query language works and reference the OData website and how all those pieces work together. And I would have spent hours trying to figure that out. And worst of all, I probably wouldn't have known about many things and just would have missed them. So I can definitely attest to that. And your OAuth course, I was unable to attend live, so I
Yeah.
took the course via recordings. And when I watched the first day, I thought, wow, this is a lot of background. Like, okay, I get the concept. Yeah. Let's jump into the code. Well, I later found out recently that there's a very good reason why there is the background of OAuth and how it works and the different types of OAuth, because I went down the road of just trying to find the answer and how to implement it, the developer, approach, just show me how and I'll do it. And I realized that one implementation behaves differently than other implementations depending on what you're trying to do, which we'll get into. So I can attest that it requires patient learning. And whether you do AJ's course and spend the time, that upfront learning is very important. And if you don't have that, you will spend many hours trying to understand the context of how to use OAuth with Business Central. And I know for you, AJ, it's pretty obvious. It's like, oh, yeah, this type of OAuth flow versus this type, it's like obvious. For me, it was absolutely not obvious. And so now that I went back for a second viewing of that first day of the class, it's starting, the light bulbs are starting to come on. And I said,
Yeah.
now I
But
get it.
let me tell you, all that information, all that knowledge, that did not come to me just in a rainy Friday afternoon. I mean, that
Yeah.
cost a lot of reading and trying out and trying to understand and get my head around, asking me exactly myself the same questions as you have been asking yourself, and yeah, that's how I built up those courses. Of course, with all that information that I gathered over time, trying to build up a story.
Yes, and I can absolutely attest that the AJ's course delivers all that information in a very compact manner that would have taken me, weeks of part-time digging to try to understand. It's just, there's a lot of information. And so someone is asking if there's a recording. And so it is not a publicly available recording. It is for attendees who did participate in the class. It is provided as part of that. And so if you are interested in that, you can contact AJ via his website and just express interest. And if there is enough interest, because it's a lot of work for him, as he mentioned, now that he's going back to work with customers, it would require that he have plenty of interest to make it worthwhile for him to rehost that course now that, the world is trying to go back to normal, I guess we can say.
But if Nick, who's asking about the recording, is wondering if you were currently watching a live event, then the answer is yes.
Got it.
This is
okay.
live.
Yeah, so this is a live stream, and this will be available as a recording on both YouTube and Twitch. So you can come back to my YouTube channel and watch this as a recording, and I'll tweet it out as well. Okay, so
they can ask questions if they need. They have a question, of course.
Yes, you can ask questions live. So, okay, so one of the things that just as an example that you share in your class is this OAuth process, and so this I I get the concept. And so you have OAuth request, you get an access token, you authenticate via some type of credentials, and then you get access to this resource. So it is more complex than just a simple web API key. But there are many things going on here that allow you to control the security, have better access control to your OAuth application. So this I totally get. And this is what AJ discussed in his course. But this one didn't quite dawn on me, the significance of this, when you were explaining it, when I first listened to you explain it. And that is the different types of OAuth flows. And I thought, okay, well, don't I want just the easiest or simplest one, like a service to service flow, which I believe is called the client credentials flow?
Yes,
and
it is.
I thought that's the one I want, right? I don't want this interactive user authentication. Just give me a code and I'm cool. I'll run with it and that'll solve all my problems. Well, that was not the case, as I've learned, depending on how you want to use it, right? It might work in some circumstances, but as I think this slide explains, there are some limitations to that client credential flow, and that is an application as the resource owner versus a user as a resource owner. So the one example where I learned this very clearly is I wanted to authenticate with Microsoft Graph to access an Office 365 mailbox. I learned that if I use the client credentials flow with the Microsoft Graph to get to Office 365, I do not authenticate as a user with access to a user's mailbox, for instance. I get authenticated with the entire Office 365 organization with access to all mailboxes. I am in that mode, I'm authenticated as an administrator. And I thought, oh, this is not what I want.
All right.
And so I then learned, okay, that's why this slide is important. I do not want Office, the client credentials flow. I need a different flow up above there so that I can authenticate as a user. I want to be only accessing that automated or API user mailbox. Now, is this the same with Business Central?
Well, yes
APIs,
and no.
web APIs, I should say.
No, yes and no. In Business Central, you of course you have those users who user accounts who do have permissions to do something, like creating invoices, posting them, etc. Now, an application can be created as a similar user, as a user account. Then it's just called an application account or application user account, which has exactly the same settings as a normal regular user. You can set permissions, and when an application is able to authenticate as being that application, he can call Business Central in the same way as you would do with a user. So no, it's not the same as with what you had with Exchange or Office 365, where an application user is suddenly kind of a admin user who has access to all mailboxes. Definitely not. Okay,
so that's good. I haven't yet looked into that configuration in Business Central, but the next slide talks about a few scenarios. My goal is that when I develop an integration with Business Central, whether that's connecting from Business Central to an outside resource or vice versa, I'm trying, in the background, I'm thinking about how can I make this as easy as possible to develop, deploy, and maintain. I don't want my customer to have to re-authenticate a user every 3 months or 6 months, right?
I see what you mean, but you really need to think about a scenario, because let's mention two scenarios, and it might be on your next slide. I don't know.
Okay, can jump to
let's see if I have those scenarios. The first one, e-commerce website. I was going to mention that one.
Yeah.
So there, somebody, let's say the customer of the customer, is definitely not somebody who has a user account in Business Central, right?
Right.
So if the website, the web shop application is going to connect to Business Central, there is only one way for him to authenticate as being the web shop account, or being the web shop itself.
Right.
So he gets his own web shop user, one single user account. Now, instead of taking one of the user accounts that can also log into the web client of Business Central, you can create a separate user for that external application, give him the required permissions, and that website can then authenticate using that user account. And then any API call that comes in from that web application, the web shop, is running, every session is running under the credentials and under the permissions, the context of that application account. So on the other hand, if you would then do something like, let's log on every record who created the record. Who's that going to be? It's going to be the web application. It's going to be the web shop, right? On every call, no matter which customer logged in, it doesn't matter. The user account is always the web shop account, right? On the other hand, if you think, and that one is not on your screen, but think about an external application for timesheets. And let's imagine that those users, they are internal users. They might have access to Business Central. Now imagine that external application for the timesheet logs everything in Business Central using his own timesheet application account. How would you know which user is entering the timesheet information? So the user must identify himself as well.
Got it. Absolutely, yes. And initially, I'm trying to conquer more of the service-to-service type communication and authentication. But yes, if you want to track user activity, makes complete sense. And in that case, though, with say timesheets, I can imagine a simple flow where the user could authenticate through Business Central, right? So it could be a device code authentication or a whatever the flow is for the user to actually authenticate. And then the application carries that token for that user. That makes sense. And so, for instance, in say the e-commerce website, where it is one connection or one application account that is sending over information, or in this example, the third-party logistics warehouse that is shipping orders or receiving inventory on behalf of the customer, what do you imagine which flow do you think would work best? Would you just do the I've already forgotten the name, the client credential flow, where you hand them a key essentially like the old school API, so that they do not have a username and password to authenticate with BC? Or would you go with a different flow?
I would definitely go with the client credentials flow here. And I do not need to know the details of that. I don't need to know the secret or application ID. Well, application ID, I need that to create the application account. But I mean, it's not necessary for me to for any other thing. I don't need the secret. That is something for that third-party application, for the website to keep that a secret, to keep it on his side. I mean, that's not necessary for Business Central.
Right, not for Business Central, but in order to give that, say, the third-party warehouse access to the API through OAuth, I need to create a secret for that client credential flow, correct?
No.
And provide that.
Well, the owner of the third party, so the third party, he needs to create that secret. So they are going through the app registration one time, in their own Azure Active Directory account. There they create the identity of the third-party application. There they get an application ID and a secret. Then the application ID identifies the third-party application, and that's the only piece of information that needs to go to Business Central for the application account in Business Central, so he can match the let's say the claim of the third party that he is an application with this ID can then be matched to a user account, an application user account in Business Central. So Business Central is capable of applying the permissions, etc.
So I had not thought that far through the process. So the third-party warehouse, they create the app registration in their Azure Active Directory.
Yes.
I'm thinking it occurs in the BC customers Azure Active Directory. Got it.
No.
And that okay. So
only if they own that application.
Right. But the third-party logistics warehouse running their own app, they could have their own Azure app registration, and they provide that information to me as a Business Central customer, and I grant them access to that external app through that external app.
Exactly.
Got it. Very interesting. Now, what if this third-party logistics warehouse, which I'm going to go out on a limb and say 100% of the 3PL warehouses I've worked with do not use Azure?
Well, if they don't use Azure, it's going to be hard to get access to Business Central. I mean, they need to be on Azure. I mean, how are they going to authenticate?
Can the BC customer do the app registration and the secret and provide that to them?
Well, if that third-party application is running as a separate installation, let's say on-prem for that customer, and he's capable of doing OAuth authentication, but just needs the app ID and the secret as a configuration setting, yes. But every single installation requires its own Azure app registration. So if it is a hosted service, then the hosted service must be registered in Azure Active Directory by the owner of that hosted service. And if it is on-prem, then of course you can say, okay, you install it on-prem, then the customer, the Business Central user, may register it in his own Azure Active Directory because that's their applications, their installation, unique installation. Nobody else is using it. So yeah, he can make a unique registration for that one.
Okay, because so in my experience, most of the 3PL warehouse applications are Linux-based, some variant of Linux, right? Mm-hmm. Some use AWS. Some use some other hosting platform for their virtual SaaS environment. And they, if I say, oh yeah, go into your Azure Active Directory, they'll look at me with a strange look and say, we don't use Azure Active Directory. So I will need to provide them some mechanism to authenticate against, say, the Business Central API.
Yes, if because how are they going to do OAuth? I mean,
right, exactly.
They need to do OAuth against Azure Active Directory in one way or the other. Okay,
so just want to confirm, I as a Business Central customer could set that up in my tenant to say, okay, I understand you're on AWS using a Linux server, use this client credential code and secret, and that will allow you to authenticate.
Not 100%. Because that application running on AWS still needs to call the APIs of Azure to get the access token with those app ID and secret.
Got it. So, but their platform can communicate with Azure AAD in order to make that request.
If so, then why are they not going to register it themselves and keep that as a secret on their side?
Because it's just an HTTP request for them from AWS to Azure, they
It
don't
is.
want to set up an Azure Active Directory account. They don't want a subscription. That's just not in their corporate platform. Does that make
Well,
sense?
okay, if that is, yeah, that makes sense. But then that means that there must be a configuration somewhere where you
Yes.
can set the Azure Active Directory identity.
Yes. And so I'm assuming they would have a config file to store the app ID and the secret, just
Yeah.
as they would with an old school API that has an API key.
All right, but then you do it in the Business Central account, tenant, Azure tenant, where you register, let's say, the configuration of that particular third-party application, whatever it is. Yes, sure.
Huh. Okay, so it sounds like I am missing a component and I need to research that further on the BC side. I'm still coming at this from the basic OAuth side, so sounds like there's other components I'm missing. And so another thing is, if I'm doing something like an Azure function that is, say, external, it's a third-party Azure function, one of the concerns I have is, okay, how do we make that simple? And I've now learned in this conversation that the person who owns that external Azure function, they can have an app registration that I set up to give it access via Business Central.
Exactly.
So I think that answers that question. And then if
Absolutely.
the customer has an Azure function, they could do this, they could set up their app registration in their Active Directory.
Exactly.
And which flow do you think is most appropriate for a customer-owned Azure function that will be communicating with Business Central? Would
Still
that...
the client credential flow.
Got it.
Because an Azure function has no user interface. It's just a service running in the background. And theoretically, it could be possible to set up a kind of a conversation with it, but it's complicated. So
Got it.
client credentials works here. And to confuse you a little bit more, so when you have that external Azure function, let's say owned by a third party who offers it for different Business Central customers, but he hosts it on his own Azure account. So he registers it for his customers as the Azure with the Azure identity. When he creates the account, he needs to indicate that it is a multi-tenant application to be accessed by multiple Azure Active Directory, multiple customers. But if it is a customer for their own Azure Active Directory, never to be used outside their Azure Active Directory tenant, then they can say this is a single tenant application.
Got it. And that makes sense. So for anyone who's looked into the app registration process, and I'm trying to pull it up quickly now, that is one of the main options when you're setting this up. It asks you about that. And so I'm just trying to find in my Azure Active Directory. Okay, so I'm going into
registrations.
Yep. And so I'm going to do app registration, and I will do a new registration. And so let me see if I can show this here. And so this is right after the name, it is the first option. And it says
Exactly.
accounts in this organization only. So this is purely internal. So it's your
tenant.
BC, your Azure AAD, and your Azure function. This should work fine, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you want to open it up to other organizations, you can choose this multi-tenant and then open it up further to include Microsoft personal accounts. And I don't know how well that works, right? So
no, that doesn't work because for Business Central, you cannot work with Microsoft accounts. It's only Office only Azure Active Directory accounts, so organizational accounts.
Got it. So really, these are these first two options are the ones that matter, and then obviously not Microsoft personal accounts only. So
no MSA.
Okay, excellent. So then, as I shared with you, I was playing around. Also, I was like, oh, I'm starting to learn this OAuth stuff, and I just happened to stumble across the fact, which I was totally oblivious to before, that Office 365 has an entire API stack available through Microsoft Graph. I thought,
It is.
wow, that's kind of nice. So I can do all sorts of crazy Office 365 stuff through Microsoft Graph, which, by the way, authenticates with OAuth. Cool, let me
Exactly.
try that. And so I created a client credential flow with a secret, and I connected to Office 365. And that is when I learned the very important lesson that different applications have different types of integration or authentication with OAuth. And Office 365, if I were to use a client credential flow, I authenticate as admin. I do not authenticate as this service mailbox, for instance, or this service calendar. And so I thought, oh, I when I authenticate, I'm not a user in Office 365. I'm admin. I can list all
Yeah.
mailboxes. And I thought, oh,
Now, well, here's the thing, Steve. Um, it actually depends on that target platform. So obviously,
yes,
for Office 365, they decided if you have an application account as granted access, then you get, as you call it, the keys to the kingdom. You get an admin account. Now, for Business Central, that is definitely not the case because the folks in Copenhagen decided to create an application account that can have its own permission sets. So that is different from what Office 365 is doing with an
yep.
application account.
Yeah, and I was really bummed by that because if I want to integrate with a calendar, right, to have automated invites, or I
Hmm.
want to send out emails or receive emails via Office 365 Graph API, I don't, well, you could technically do it with a client credential, but it seems to be less convenient based on my initial test because then I need to dig into a specific mailbox. I'm not just authenticated as that user. And
Yeah,
so I need to work through that. And so now I realize
yeah.
that and I'm backing up and saying, okay, maybe a client credential flow isn't what I want. But then I
Hmm.
have to ask the question, what if I want BC to talk to Office 365? Or I want an Azure function to talk to O365 via Graph? Well, if I don't use client credential, then I'm going to have to deal with a device code or, some direct interactive authentication, which has
Yes,
its own hassles, right?
yes, that's correct. And so talking about Business Central, you already have a user interface there where an Azure Active Directory user has logged in. So the only thing that you actually need to do is ask that user one time, do you trust me to access your mailbox or agenda or whatever you want to have on Office 365? Files, it could be different things. So that's the only thing you need to do. One time ask that user, please trust me to get access to your resources. Then, as long as the user is logged in and he clicks on whatever button that needs an interaction with an email or an agenda or whatsoever, you have that access. You don't need to ask that again from the user. That would be totally invisible for the user that you are now going to access Office 365. It will just be working. And well, an Azure function does not have a user interface. It's a service. So there must be a user interface somewhere
Mm-hmm.
that is working with those Azure functions. And then the user interface takes care of the logging in of the user, and then it should work.
And so, in the one of the scenarios I'm thinking of is, what if I want to have an automated process in Business Central, say a job queue, to interact
Hmm.
with Office 365 via the Graph API?
Hmm.
That could potentially be trickier. I don't necessarily want those emails or calendar invites sending out as Steve, the Business Central user, or
Hmm.
Steve's email. So I, I'm seeing the potential complexities, and I need to work through these mechanics of how do I get these pieces to work together. it's not necessarily as simple as I thought.
No, that's less obvious because in that case, what you then need to do is, first of all, when you run a background process like the job queue, then you need to allow the background process to access the resources, the Graph API, unattended in the first place. So you need to have offline access without the user being logged into the user interface. That's the first thing. Then the second thing is you need to have one-time interaction with that particular user to grant access. Well, that is something you can easily do with the Business Central user interface, asking, hey, can you please give me access? And the nice thing is that pop-up that comes up can be for a different user. So it does not have to be the logged in user.
Okay.
You can ask, hey, log in as the user that you want to give access to. Then you get that access token and a refresh token. You store the refresh token, which then can be used for offline access.
Now that you explain it, makes total sense. So I can be logged in as Business Central as Steve. And when I complete the configuration process for my job queue, I will read the instructions and it will say, please authenticate to Azure Active Directory as the process user you want to use for this Office 365 integration.
There you go. And a pop-up that you open is when you do nothing in the parameters to that URL will just log you in as the current user. But there is a parameter that says always log in, which means that you as the Business Central user gets a pop-up with a login dialog. And then you
with
can
a full
use
username or email address for AAD.
There you go. There you go.
Got it. So I think I've learned lots of lessons, but many of the lessons represented here in this list is fundamentally that I can't just throw two API keys at an integration. I really need to think about the different flows, and I understand why that's important now. I need to think about, okay, how am I going to interact? How is this process going to interact, whether that's internal, third party, all these components. It's not fundamentally complex, but it's a more complex scenario than just a simple generic web API key. And I think that's the big lesson I'm learning here. It's like, I need to think this through a little more carefully.
Yes, and the reason for that, the background reason is that you actually let Azure Active Directory manage the security, manage the identity, and you do not have to store any secret information, passwords, and do authentication checks or authorization checks or whatsoever in your application. It's not in Business Central. It's only in Azure Active Directory. Who specializes in that?
Yes, and as I have seen many times, API keys can result in compromises, and you don't want to be handing out keys to anyone for Business Central. And also there's the story of people search GitHub and other public Git repositories for API keys that have been accidentally checked into code. And it is surprisingly common how often that happens. I may or may not have made that mistake once in my life. And fortunately, it was with a private repo, but still, I'm a bit mortified about that. And after I learned that lesson, I was like, ouch. I'm now super paranoid about API keys, right? So they are the keys to the kingdom oftentimes. So,
absolutely.
Thank you very much. Any other closing thoughts on OAuth and BC Web APIs?
Well, it is going to be difficult for many people, I'm afraid. And it seems that the client credentials flow is the easiest one to use because it only requires a call to Azure Active Directory, and you get an access token and you have access to Business Central. But the thing is that you do not distinguish between users. You are just using one user account to call Business Central APIs, and there is a little, well, kind of a caveat here, that the application account that you create in Business Central does not require a user license. So you could think, oh, wait, that is easy. I just create an application account and off I go. But that is absolutely not what you should do, because there is something called license terms, and in the licensing guide they explain that that is only allowed for non-users, employees,
non-interactive.
Well, it could be even at least non-interactive, of course, but I mean also users that are not doing any business process for you. So as soon, for example, that e-commerce website is doing more than just entering orders, if they are actually releasing and shipping orders, then you're already very close, or maybe cross the line of doing a internal process, which means that you should stay away from that and rather go with a background process, monitoring the incoming orders, and maybe do some checkup on everything okay, and then release that order, because then it's an internal user who started that job queue, and an internal user who releases it so it can be picked from the warehouse. And these are the things that is easily overlooked, but you definitely need to match the licensing terms in order to get client credentials done in the right way.
That is a good point. During a recent office hours call with the Business Central team, they discussed OAuth, and they did mention the licensing, but they only referred questions about licensing to the licensing doc. And I totally understand. They said, look, we're not going to answer licensing questions. Please read the licensing doc. But as they showed the relevant portion of that licensing doc, like those were English words on the page. It meant nothing to me. So I'll have to reread that about 5 times to see if I can understand what it means and where that line is. But I think your explanation is good. So any business process involvement, anything short of just pushing data in or getting data out, that type of thing.
Exactly. Okay. And they made it a little bit vague by purpose, not only to stay away from scenarios, but also to make sure that it is future-proof. And I can tell you a little secret. I did a review on that document.
Okay.
And I gave them quite some feedback on that part. Yeah.
I don't think any licensing is never on our top 10 list of things we want to deal with typically, right? So absolutely. I empathize with them. I understand their concerns and what they're having to weigh. That, let's just say I'm familiar with other ERP systems where a third party has developed an entire UI to replicate functionality, and they integrate with no user licenses. And so it does happen, and I understand them wanting to avoid that because, a third party can leverage the millions of dollars in investment in Business Central without buying any user licenses. And, so I get it. So, okay, I'll need to read the licensing. I need to look into that application user in Business Central. And I need to think through how I can handle these scenarios in different versions of these scenarios, depending on whether it's BC, Office 365, some other Azure application, Azure Functions, etc.
Final comment from me. If any of the people who's watching this now or later are visiting Directions in Milan end of October, I will be hosting a session about OAuth, and there will be a second session about client credentials specifically, hosted by Camille, also an MVP. We were working together to align content, but make sure if you are there to visit both of those sessions, because there will be a lot of information in there.
Excellent. And also, you recently gave a presentation at DynamicsCon on OAuth,
I
correct?
did. I did.
Okay.
Yes.
And so I tried to attend that, but the link had already been shut down because I think it was at the end of the day. So I
Okay.
was unable to get in. So I'm waiting for that to go on YouTube to watch that as well. Or I think they are also making it available on the recordings available on their website first and then YouTube.
Yeah.
So
That
those
was a
will be
dressed up one.
available.
I was
Okay.
absolutely dressed up for that one.
Yes, yes, you got the best dressed award there. Excellent.
There you go.
Well, thank you very much, AJ. I appreciate it. And for those of you who are learning OAuth and BC Web APIs and understanding this, I can just say from my perspective, it took a while for this to sink into my brain. It was not obvious to me at all. I know some people were very quick to pick this up, but I don't know if they understand all the context and all these implications with the Azure Active Directory, the different types of flows, and how you can integrate with BC. So
Yeah.
I'll just share that my experience is still ongoing. I'm still slowly learning all these pieces and figuring out how to integrate them into the applications I want to build.
And then if you are ready, Steve, then contact me again. I have some other things that around OAuth that can definitely baffle you.
Okay, and maybe I don't think it'll be difficult if we did a Stump Steve session. That wouldn't be difficult. I'd be stumped pretty quickly, but yeah,
No, I don't believe
very
so.
cool. So I am very much a beginner. I am trying to learn, but I'm slowly along the path, and I'm gonna rewatch the videos a few times to just get a feel and understand how to do what I'm trying to do with OAuth and Business Central.
Super.
Okay, thank you very much, AJ, and thanks everyone for watching. Have a good one.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, for having me.